Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. has signed the Create More Act this November, a law that promises to attract more foreign investments and boost economic growth by reducing the corporate income tax rate from 25% to 20% for registered business enterprises or RBEs. The Create More also offers a VAT zero rating on essential services like marketing, human resources, among others, that are directly attributable to the registered project or activity of a registered company. Also, under Create More, the power of investment promotion agencies or IPAs will also be expanded, taking over significant powers from the Fiscal Incentives Review Board or FIRB. This shift gives IPAs more autonomy to manage and promises to promote investment opportunities within their specific sectors or regions. However, some economic experts have expressed concerns that the newly signed law could potentially create more problems and undermine the existing Create Law, which was signed in March 2021. To take a closer look at Create More, I will be speaking with Pia Rodrigo, a communications officer at Action for Economic Reforms. Good day, Miss Pia. I'm so happy that you joined us for our B-side episode. Alright, so let's kick off this interview with our first question. In your column with Mr. Santa Ana, it was stated that the enactment of the Create More Act will undermine the existing Create Law or could potentially create more troubles. So, can you enlighten us about that?
So, just for a brief background, the Create Bill was actually implemented in 2021. So, just 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago. And the goal of the Create Bill was actually to rationalize the fiscal incentive system. So by that, it intended to really limit the scope and the coverage of the incentives that we give to companies. It tried to really limit also the duration. So the problem that we were having for over 30 years was that companies were receiving incentives basically in perpetuity or forever. And these incentives, whether in the form of tax deductions or other non-tax incentives, are actually just meant to motivate or to enable a company to locate in the Philippines. So that's really the intention of an incentive, and so it does not make sense to give these companies incentives for too prolonged periods of time. Another very important feature of the Create Bill from 2021 was that it really strengthened the role of the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, or the FIRB. So the FIRB was previously not as powerful as it became in Create. What Create did was it made FIRB the ultimate policymaker and approver of all fiscal incentives for companies with investments above 1 billion pesos, for projects above 1 billion pesos. So previously, it was the investment promotion agencies, or IPAs, which had control over who to give incentives to. So these IPAs include PEZA, KIEZA, and those development organizations. So previously, they had the power to give incentives without proper rationale or rationalization. And so the FIRB being strengthened was very, very important so that we could put a stop to the revenue leakages that were happening due to this very arbitrary, very undisciplined way of giving incentives. So the goal of Create was to make incentives rationalized, time-bound, targeted, and transparent. And it also created a plan, so very specific investment priorities, which the Philippines will focus on and will give incentives to, so that companies can create more jobs and create more jobs that bring great value to the Philippines. And what Create More, which was just very recently passed, actually does is it reverses so many provisions from Create, And essentially, it almost repeals many provisions. So I'll just name a few now. So one of the things that Create More does is it really limits the power of the FIRB and returns a lot of that power to the IPAs, or in the investment promotion agencies. So before, the investment capital threshold for businesses subject to the FIRB's approval process was 1 billion from the Create Bill. And then after Create More, it is now at 15 billion. So if I recall correctly, when the Department of Finance provided some computations, I think 99% of investments are below 15 billion. So essentially, the FIRB can now only approve and have direct oversight over these very big projects, and almost all of the other projects will be in the hands of the IPAs. And another important function that was taken away from the FIRB was the ability to gather data, to audit, and to cancel or withdraw fiscal incentives enjoyed by businesses. So those are just a few of the dangerous provisions of Create More, and our concern is really that this bill was not. This bill was originally, actually, when Create More was first brought up, the rationale behind it was to make the VAT refund mechanism more clear and to make implementation easier for companies. So there were some problems with how companies were interpreting Create More. And so that was the original intent, so they say. But essentially, what it did was it catered to the interests of certain companies which really wanted to have their incentives, the criteria for incentives loosened. And unfortunately, the final version of the bill really had a devastating effect to not only the power of the FIRB, but it also enhanced the incentives. So the menu of incentives that the companies can now avail themselves of is much wider, much broader. And we project that this will lead to even more revenue losses. So during this time of shrinking or tightening fiscal space, we think it's important to protect the revenues that we already have. And so we're also very concerned over the fact that giving all these deductions will result in more revenue losses.
So I would like to ask this. Will the Create More Act have an impact on micro, small, medium enterprises, or MSMEs, which comprises a very large part of business enterprises here in the Philippines?
Well, one of the things that the original Create bill did was it actually lowered the corporate income tax rates of MSMEs to 20%. So I think that is something that will benefit these MSMEs. It was a much needed stimulus measure that they were able to get because it was legislated during the pandemic, right? But I think for most MSMEs, I feel like one of the positive points about Create is that it does make some clarifications when it comes to VAT refunds. So the process is simplified through Create More, and it'll be easier to get VAT refunds. So I think that is mainly how it will affect them. It could be pro MSME. It could be pro business in general. By that I mean certain businesses will definitely stand to gain from these provisions, but also at the same time we have to note that these incentives are usually being these incentives are usually given to foreign locators who want to locate in the Philippines. So I think it's more of a foreign investment. It will has a bigger impact on foreign investment than local MSMEs.
All right, thank you very much for that. So let's move on. Senator Gatchalian said in one of his statements that the Create More would attract more investors. So may I know your take on that?
Yes. So actually, one of the main arguments against the original Create bill, was that it would be changing the rules in the middle of the game, or it would be signaling some sort of instability or uncertainty to our foreign investors, right? But in the end, we believe, or AER believes, that it was actually very clarifying, or it clarified a lot of the rules, at least most of the provisions. And so our belief is that what Create More actually does is to signify that there is policy instability, because it's really only been 3 years since Create was implemented, and it's very normal for reforms to undergo teething problems, or to undergo these growing pains, right, when they're implemented at the start. And it involves a lot of institutional change. So we believe that actually going back and saying, oh no, wait, we're going to amend this law, it actually shows that our legislators and our government in general are showing signs of instability, and that there is pressure, so that our legislators are kind of folding or bending to the will of the vested interests who really benefit from a regime that gives them almost perpetual fiscal incentives. And then I think one additional point is that Create More does not necessarily address the binding constraints to investment in the Philippines. So the binding constraints that many studies have shown are really what deter investors from coming to the Philippines is they're actually price and fiscal stability, sound governance, policy certainty. So as I mentioned earlier, this is actually a very shaky policy, right? Or it shows that there are some inconsistencies with their policy. And lastly, reliable infrastructure. So we all know that the cost of electricity is very high in the Philippines, and when surveyed, a lot of investors really say that that's the reason why they choose not to invest here. So if we really want to improve our investment climate, we have to have more cohesive and strategic targeted economic policies, and also improve the capability of our agencies to implement these policies. So I think the last point about our binding constraints is really human capital development. So increasing the capacity of our workforce to do high value work, supporting education, because if we want to increase the country's capacity to absorb the benefits of investments, not just foreign but also local, we need to give our workforce a fighting chance.
I wanted to point out what you've said, that Create More will not necessarily solve the binding constraints from investing in the Philippines. So, what are your recommended provisions, or should we stay with the ongoing Create Law?
Actually, upon analysis of the House version of the Create More bill and also the Senate version, the original intent of the Create Law, which was to just clarify the VAT refund regime and to make it a lot simpler, could actually just be addressed through the IRR, amending the implementing rules and regulations of the Create Act from 2021. And aside from that, the Ease of Paying Taxes Act has also actually addressed some of those difficulties. So the EOPT Act was actually quite substantial, and it was passed, I think, last year, in addressing those VAT refund problems. And then another thing that could have actually addressed those points of confusion would be a revenue regulation from the BIR. So the BIR could have easily just issued a revenue regulation to clarify how to implement CREATE, and this did not need, we believe that it did not need a law to be amended, because the dangerous thing about opening up the law for amendment is a lot of vested interests can come in, and which is exactly what happened, right? So they all came in and lobbied for their own deductions, for their own interests, and what ended up happening was basically a version of the bill that went directly against the heart of what CREATE intended to do.
Alright, so I want to go back about what you've mentioned, that Create More will expand the power of investment promotion agencies, or IPAs. So, what are the implications of this change now?
So, what actually was happening before the CREATE law was passed was IPAs were giving incentives to companies even without proper justifications. So they were very arbitrary in the way that they approved incentives. So I guess one silver lining, or one good thing that was not really touched so much in Create More was that there's now an SIPP, or a strategic investment priority plan. So that outlines really how that really outlines where we want to invest, like what specific industries, what specific sectors we want to invest, and there are also certain incentives that you can get based on your location. So we want to promote investments in far-flung areas, in more rural areas, and underdeveloped areas. So we do have that guide now, and actually it was a good thing that Senator Pia Cayetano, who was the sponsor of the Create Act when it was heard on the floor in 2020, she actually proposed the removal of another SIPP, a local SIPP, which the Senate version proposed, which would have established a whole new set of priorities and plans just for each specific IPA or locality. So that would have made it very easy for IPAs to insert arbitrarily whichever company or whichever sector they felt like giving incentives to. So thankfully, we still have some of those institutions in place.
All right, so I would like to dig in from the first question that I've asked. So what are the landmarks or achievements of the Create Law that will be undermined by Create More?
Right. So the main highlight of the Create Law, which is being threatened by its amendment to Create More, is really the power of the Fiscal Incentive Review Board. So through Create More, the FIRB, or the Fiscal Incentive Review Board, is now no longer the main agency that handles the approval of incentives, and rather this is now being given to the IPAs, or the investment promotion agencies. And any performance reviews or investigations, which the FIRB previously was supposed to do through Create, and that was really a landmark, or the core of Create, is that FIRB has accountability to keep the businesses on point and keep them on their targets, make sure that they perform well, and that their incentives are justified by their performance. So any performance reviews done by RBEs now have to be done with the investment promotion agency. So the FIRB can no longer unilaterally decide on disciplinary measures like suspending or withdrawing incentives. And that was a very important part of the Create Act when it was passed. And another, I think the second point is that the Create More expands fiscal incentives greatly. The menu of fiscal incentives is expanded greatly. So there's now a much broader set of deductible and VAT exempt or zero rated expenses, there are now longer periods of package enjoyment. So businesses can now avail themselves of these incentives for much longer, and also a longer sunset provision for businesses who were enjoying the fiscal incentives prior to create. So in essence, we're going to give more incentives, and this will lead to foregone revenue for our government. And those I think are the top two. I think one more key dilution of Create is in Create More, the president is now allowed to modify or approve the grant of fiscal incentives even without the recommendation of the FIRB. So this will really allow businesses to go directly to our president and to request incentives from him. So this really defeats the purpose of rationalizing the regime and making things targeted and performance-based, and it really opens up more political or more politicizing in the way that we grant incentives.
So with a more lenient approval of tax incentives, as what you've mentioned, since FIRB's recommendation is not required anymore, do you think there could be a possibility of abuse?
Definitely. There are many sectors kasi that are greatly affected. But for example, one of the benefits that was expanded was companies can now avail themselves of deductions when they go to trade fairs or for tourism-related events. So it's something that wasn't included in the first version of Create, because really the government wanted to make Create very, very rationalized and targeted. So I think it's hard to pinpoint a very specific sector that could gain, right? But definitely there are some insertions. If you'll notice, actually, the Create More, it jumped from, I think, 60 pages to 120 pages. So a lot of insertions were made, and it's actually a huge blow to what Create originally was.
All right, I'm down now to our last question. So where should our lawmakers focus to attract more foreign investors?
It's not where you're right. It's not really incentives that determine the willingness of investors to come and locate here in the Philippines. I think one of the bills that should really be, or one of the reforms that should really be prioritized is having lower electricity rates for the Philippines. So definitely we need to come up with sectoral reforms for our energy sector, because that's really one thing that deters the location of investors. And one other thing that is very, very important to address is really governance and corruption. So good governance and having less corruption will really enjoin investors to come here. They'll have more trust in our government that, you know, we will take care of their business, and their business can really flourish here. So, you know, I think the chaos and the corruption that thrive here in our institutions are not very conducive to foreign businesses. So aside from infrastructure, it's really improving our governance. And thirdly, I think it's investing in our human capital. So having more a focus on industrial policy that's very strategic, and having a plan for enhancing the capacities of our workforce really need to be addressed. I think one one thing to note is that we do have some good laws. It's really the implementation. It's really the agency's capacity to implement these laws, and that's where we kind of falter. So those three things, I think, are what we need to focus on.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rodrigo, for having this interview with you. Do you have any last statement to wrap up this podcast episode?
The fact that Create More was passed so quickly should be very concerning to Filipinos. And the fact that the vested interests were really able to get in there and influence our policymakers so easily, I think it should be a wake-up call that we need to hold them to account better. And I guess it's already for signing for the president. So and it was his own directive to pass it very quickly. So I mean, it was something that definitely, like, all the forces combined to make something like that happen. But I hope that our government can also consider all the other binding constraints that really are deterring investments, rather than focusing on these very dangerous bills that roll back previous reforms, like the Create Act. So I think that's all from my end.
In our conversation with Ms. Rodrigo, she emphasized that enacting the Create More Act, or offering tax incentives alone, does not address the fundamental constraints to investing in the Philippines. The country must focus on improving prices, such as energy costs, to develop more cohesive and strategic economic policies, enhancing the capability of agencies to implement these policies effectively, and ultimately, improving the country's image by addressing corruption through sound governance. These critical areas of improvement are essential for fostering a favorable overall investment climate in the Philippines. This has been another episode of B-Side. Again, this is Edge Eva. Subscribe now and enjoy industry insights on Philippine business and beyond.